Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here to be able to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Tokyo International University. And it's also an honor to follow the speech by Mr. Kimura, with which I fully agreed. Let me address the question of U.S.-China relations and the implications for Japan. Some people say that the 21st century is the Chinese century, that the 20th century was the American century and that we're now in the Chinese century. Since I just published a book that says the American century is not over, it's clear I don't agree with this sentiment. But it is an important question for us to look at, because there is a long-standing view that when you have an established power, and there is a challenge from a rising power, that this can create a great conflict. This, of course, is the famous Thucydides trap, where when Thucydides was asked why the ancient Greek city-states tore itself apart and ceased to be the center of the ancient world, he said it was caused by the rise in the power of Athens and the fear that created in Sparta. And similarly, many people have said that World War I, when the European state system tore itself apart and ceased to be the center of global power, was caused by the rise of the power of Germany and the fear that created in Britain. And some people say that the 21st century will see a similar conflict caused by the rise in the power of China and the fear it creates in the United States. Indeed, one of my colleagues, John Mearsheimer, who is a professor at the University of Chicago, has said flat out that China cannot rise peacefully. If so, we're in for a very bad century. Fortunately, I think this is wrong. The people who say that the U.S. is in decline and therefore it must be fearful about the rise of China and that China will pass the United States, I don't think have evidence on their side. If it were true, then we might have to worry about this famous Thucydides trap. But I'm going to give you my view as to why it's not true. First of all, the U.S. is not in decline. Some people say that the United States is like ancient Rome and that it is in a period of terminal decline. But if you look at ancient Rome, it did not decline because of the rise of another empire. It declined because of internal warfare and no productivity in its economy. Contrast that with the United States. While we often dispute things politically, we're not involved in internal warfare. And when you look at the productivity in the economy, there's a surprising degree of long-term strength in the American economy. Let me give you a few examples. If you look at demography, the population of the world today, you have China is the largest, India is second, the United States is third. According to UN demographers, in 2050, it will be India first, China second, but the US will still be third. That's interesting because the US is the only advanced country which will maintain its ranking demographically. And a lot of that is due to the openness of the United States to immigration. The second thing that's worth noticing about a long-term strength of the American economy is in the field of energy, where if we looked 10 years ago, we would have seen a United States which was increasingly dependent upon imported energy. Today, we notice that the shale revolution, in which the technologies of horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing have been applied to shale rock, has unleashed resources of oil and gas, which leads the International Energy Agency in Paris to project that North America may not be importing energy at all in the 2020s. Another thing to look at in terms of long-run strength of the economy is the technologies that are most important to the 21st century. If you look at biotechnology, nanotechnology, or the third generation of information technology, the United States is generally acclaimed as being on the forefront of all three of these. And if you look at the underlying structure of production of knowledge, and you look at the universities, Shanghai Jiao Tong University has done a survey of world universities, and what they've shown is that of the 20 leading universities in the world, 15 are in the United States, and none are in China. So this view that the United States is in decline strikes me as not consistent with the facts. But even if the United States is not in decline, the question still arises of whether China is going to pass the United States. And sometimes people say that China already has passed the United States or soon will pass the United States. And if you look at overall power, it has three components. It has economic power, military power, and soft power, which is the ability to affect others to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. But let's start with economic power, because that's the one that gets most attention. Particularly in the aftermath of the Great Recession, when the United States economy was suffering negative growth and China with a stimulus package was growing at 10% a year, many people said this proves that China is about to pass the United States. And they would take the growth curves based on the current performance and extrapolate them into the future. And some people would say that China would pass the United States as the largest economy by 2020. When the recession was over and the American economy began growing again at about 2.5%, and the Chinese economy began to slow down to what they called officially 7%, then people said, oh, well, then China may not pass the United States until 2030. But if the Chinese growth rate continues to decline, which my colleague Larry Summers thinks it will, to 3.9% or something in that range, then China will not be larger than the US until 2040 or 2050. And even if it is larger than the US as a total size of an economy, it will not be richer in terms of per capita income. And per capita income is sometimes seen as a measure of the sophistication of an economy. Total economic size gives some economic power, but the sophistication of an economy also matters. It means that when you are trying to produce something like a jet engine, you either produce it very well or not very well. For example, China does not produce very good jet engines. So as we look ahead in terms of economic power, even if China is larger than the US in 2050, it will not be a more sophisticated economy than the US as measured by per capita income. So I don't see China about to pass the US in economic power. If we then turn to military power, the Chinese have been increasing their military budget, as Mr. Kimura said, by double digits for more than a decade. But even so, the United States military budget is 4 times the Chinese military budget. And if you look at the ability to project military power globally, The United States has that capacity. It's unlikely that China will have that capacity in the next half century. Finally, you have the third dimension of power, soft power, which is this ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. China has been paying a good deal of attention to soft power because it realizes that it can make its hard power more palatable if it's attractive with soft power. So it's spending a good deal of money on Confucius Institutes and on turning Xinhua and CCTV into full-term cable networks and so forth. But it has not been very successful in this, as public opinion polls will show. The BBC has taken a poll, and Pew Charitable Trust has taken a poll that show that both Japan and the US are more attractive to other countries in Asia than China is. If you ask why China hasn't done better in soft power, it really has two obstacles to overcome. One is the control of civil society by the Communist Party, which means China is not willing to use the full resources of its people. If you have somebody as creative as Ai Weiwei, and you wind up locking him up, that's not the way to increase your soft power. The other problem China has, of course, is it has territorial disputes with its neighbors. And it's difficult to attract others if you are at the same time disputing their territory. For example, it does you very little good to set up a Confucius Institute in Manila to make yourself attractive to the people of the Philippines if at the same time Chinese naval ships are chasing Philippine fishing boats out of Scarborough Shoal, which is claimed by both countries. So China has not been able to do that well with soft power either. So on all three of these dimensions of power, I do not see China about to pass the United States. Now, why does that matter? It's not just for bragging rights of, the US is #1 or something. It goes back to that proposition I told you about Thucydides and about the dangers of the rising power creating fear in the established power. If you look at Germany, in 1900, Germany had passed Britain, so that even before World War I, Britain had fears of what Germany was doing. If you believe the numbers which I just provided to you, and they're given in more detail in my new book, then you will see that China is not about to pass the US. If that's true, then we don't have to succumb to fear. We have plenty of time to manage the rise of China, and it should be possible to manage a peaceful rise of China. But the real answer to this, I think, is not just the United States acting alone, but it's the closeness of the US-Japan relationship, again, something that Mr. Kimura referred to. Back in the 1990s, when I was serving in the Pentagon, we could already see the rise in the power of China. And the question was, what strategy should the US have to deal with this rising power? There were some people who said we should contain it before it gets too strong. We should try to isolate the Chinese, create alliances against the Chinese, hold them back before they get too strong. We rejected that as a strategy for several reasons. First of all, it would have been very difficult to get allies in containment because most countries in Asia wanted good economic relations with China, even as they wanted protection against China in the security field. So trying to create a NATO against China would not have been easily done. But even more important, if we had treated China as an enemy at that time, we would have been guaranteeing an enemy in the future. And it was an open question of whether China could become a peaceful country or not. So we offered an open hand to China of integrating China into the international system. We sponsor Chinese membership in the World Trade Organization. We accept Chinese trade to the point that we even have a major trade deficit with China. We accept Chinese students in American university. There are more than 250,000 Chinese students in American university. This is not containment, as we saw in the days of the Cold War, when there was no trade between the US and the Soviet Union and very little social exchange. But at the same time, we realized that if we simply opened our hands to China and integrated China, there was always a danger that China could turn out badly. It might turn into a bully. And therefore, it was important to have a hedge, an insurance policy. And we and the Japanese faced the same problem. Japan wanted to trade with China, but it also wanted to make sure that if China turned into a bully, that it had protection. And that's why in 1996, you had President Clinton and Prime Minister Hashimoto reaffirming the US-Japan Security Treaty as the basis of stability for the post-Cold War period. You remember in 1993, at the end of the Cold War, 92 and 3, there were some people in America who were saying, we don't need Japan anymore, the Cold War is over. And there were some people in Japan that said, we don't need the United States anymore. We can turn to the UN for our security. We took the opposite view. We said that reaffirming the US-Japan Security Treaty could provide a basis of stability for East Asia in the post-Cold War period. And that essentially is what the Clinton-Hashimoto Declaration says. And it's turned out to be correct. Every economic relationship depends on a security framework. When there is no security, markets fail because people are unwilling to trade and invest. But by having a firm security basis for East Asia, what we've seen is the enormous growth and prosperity of the East Asian region, which has been a benefit to China, to Japan, to the United States, and to the world. So I would argue that this idea of integrate but hedge, bring China into the global system, but keep the US-Japan Security Treaty as a way to make sure China does not act as a bully, has been a very successful strategy. Now, in that sense, I think you can imagine a way of looking at East Asia and the implications for Japan as seeing it as a triangle of relations, in which if there are good relations between the US and China, between China and Japan, and between Japan and the United States, that triangle of stability will allow the economy to continue to prosper. But notice that it's essential that we realize that the leg of that triangle that includes the US and Japan is an alliance. The leg of the triangle with China is not. US and Japan share the fact that they are not threats to each other, and they are both democracies. With China, it's not a democracy, and we do concern ourselves about potential threats. So in that sense, the stability of the East Asian region, and with it the stability of the world, rests very heavily on maintaining this US-Japan security relationship. This is why I personally welcomed the new legislation that Mr. Kimura mentioned and described. By allowing Japan to participate in its right of collective self-defense, it means that the US forces and the Japanese self-defense forces will be able to conduct plans and exercises which will make them more effective. And that's important because the extent to which we're effective in working together, we will have an even stronger deterrent effect. Another way of putting this is that working together, the United States and Japan want good relations with China, We want good economic ties with China, both of us, but we also want to make sure that China has an incentive to behave well in the security area. We call that shaping the environment. It's not containment, as in the Cold War, where you tried to isolate Russia or the Soviet Union. It's shaping the environment in a way where if China sees a chance to be a bully, it realizes that the US and Japan working together will be stronger, and therefore it has incentives to follow responsible behavior. That's why I think the recent legislation was a good step forward, and it is not something which expresses hostility toward China. On the contrary, it is part of a policy of integration, but insurance. And that makes sense. There will be times when we will have to take firm positions against things that China is doing. If you look at the recent summit between President Xi Jinping and President Obama in Washington, you'll notice that there were two items on the agenda which were difficult and contentious. One of them was the issue of cyber espionage for commercial purposes. For years, the Chinese had said that they didn't do it and refused to make any agreements about it. But after the United States sanctioned China by indicting 5 PLA officers for cyber espionage and threatened further sanctions, when President Xi was in Washington, he promised that China would not use cyber espionage for commercial purposes. It's too early to know how this will turn out, but it was a major change in the formal position that China had taken up to that point. Similarly, the other major issue where there was difficulty between the US and China was the issue of the South China Sea. The Chinese have always been very ambiguous about the meaning of the 9-dashed line which they have drawn around the South China Sea. Does it mean they think of it as a territorial sea, or does it simply mean that within that area there are some features which they claim to have sovereignty over? The United States has for decades said that we will not take a position on the sovereignty of any of the rocks or shoals or islands which are disputed between 5 different countries in the South China Sea. But we do believe that the sea is not a territorial sea or a Chinese lake, and that it is governed by the rules of the Law of the Sea Treaty, which is an international treaty, which China has signed. So when China takes a shoal, something like Mischief Reef or Fiery Island Cross Reef, and piles sand on it, piling sand on a rock does not give it territorial rights under the Law of the Sea Treaty. So after China created these artificial islands, the United States said, no, we don't recognize that as territory. They remain points, rocks, shoals, whatever, and we won't contest the rock's sovereignty between you or Vietnam or Philippines or anybody. We will contest that it owns the sea out to 12 miles. And when the Chinese didn't agree to that, as you saw this past week, we conducted a freedom of navigation operation to sail through the water inside 12 miles to prove that that was what the Law of the Sea Treaty allowed. It's also worth noticing that the US also sailed within 12 miles of rocks and shoals owned by the Philippines and by Vietnam. The point is to make that it was not simply an anti-Chinese gesture. It was an effort to prove that this sea, the South China Sea, is governed by the Law of the Sea Treaty, and that that's where we will take our stand. So that illustrates what I said about relations with China with 2 areas where there was a contentious relationship, cyber espionage and South China Sea. But notice there are other areas where we work well with China and want to continue to. In trade, in areas that affect the global commons. For example, President Obama and President Xi Jinping have made enormous progress since the 2009 Copenhagen conference, which was something of a failure on environmental issues. And I think the US and China will be much closer together, along with other countries, at the conference that's about to be held on climate in Paris in another month or so. So we have areas where we will cooperate with China, areas where we will compete with China, and these are areas where we share common interests with Japan. Japan has the same sort of interests in countering terrorism, in dealing with climate change, in dealing with pandemics, which we will all have to work together on, but it also has interests in making sure that China will behave as what Bob Zoellick once called a responsible stakeholder in the area of Asia, and particularly in relations with its neighbors. And in that, I think the bulwark of stability and prosperity for East Asia is the maintenance of the US-Japan Security Treaty. In that sense, I think the US-China relations are important, but they have enormous implications for Japan, but also US-Japan relations have enormous implications for China. So thank you very much.
ナイ先生、ありがとうございました。アメリカは衰退していない、中国がアメリカにとって変わることはないということをさまざまな側面から裏付けしていただきながらお話しいただきました。また、日米中の3つの関係性を考えるべきであるというご指摘もいただきました。皆様、ナイ先生にもう一度拍手をお願いいたします。続きまして、次の講演です。元外交官で、現在は外交評論家としてご活躍されている岡本幸夫先生にご講演いただきます。岡本先生は現在 MIT マサチューセッツ工科大学国際問題研究センターのシニアフェローとして教育研究分野にも深く携わっていらっしゃいます。演題は日中関係と米国への示唆です。それでは岡本先生、よろしくお願いいたします。